All right, so I want to resume our discussion of American hegemony, and we've been talking about how it came into being, which was in a lot of ways a product of the aftermath of World War II, where the United States was the only country with a manufacturing capability left. It had acquired most of the world's gold, and it had sole possession of the atomic bomb, and basically had turned the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans into American lakes. So as a result of that, and as a result of the incredible devastation in Europe and the lack of infrastructure in the areas of the colonies in Africa and Southeast Asia and in Latin America, really the task of trying to pull the world out of the calamity of World War II, and it was just that, fell to the United States. And the United States was able to construct a system of rules and a system that in theory was supposed to maximize American power in the present, but also was a way of looking to the future, which was a way of trying to maintain American power well into the future. And the way it did that, interestingly, was constraining itself, right? So it created a system of rules and a system of institutions that meant that the United States was not going to always get what it wanted in the international system. It was not going to impose its will on everybody. It was going to work through these rules and institutions, which when they were engineered, had American preferences in mind, and therefore were going to more likely than not lead to outcomes that were going to be positive for the United States, but more than anything, we're going to maintain a stable system going forward. I was going to maintain the significance of the United States and the power of the United States, though at each individual turn, the United States was not going to get what it wants, right? So this created a very successful post-war system for the United States that I think you could argue now with several shocks. One of them being the outcome of the war on terror, one of them being the financial crisis of 2008, and now the coronavirus outbreak of the present day of 2020 and the subsequent financial crisis that that's caused. This may lead to some fractures within the system that the United States created. So we want to talk about those today and talk about some of the fissures that exist and where we might see problems into the future. I think it's fair to say that for the foreseeable future, given the behavior of the Fed, given that the Fed has been willing to issue dollars, buy dollars, send dollars into the system, and people have been willing to hold on to dollars as a safe asset, that the United States for right now is safe. But again, I'll go back to the statement I've been repeating sort of ad nauseum today. No power has reached the level of the United States and stayed there. The United States could be the first for all I know. But historically, the sun set on the British Empire. So we want to think, again, going forward, what are some of the challenges that are out there? What can cause some unraveling? Not one of it is going to cause the entire unraveling, but where are some of the problems and how can the United States address those? So before we do that, I do want to reemphasize how much Americans benefit from the current system. So some of these slides are just repeating from before, but I do want to go over them a bit more carefully now. We went over them a little bit quicker last time. So just to reiterate, because the United States is the world's reserve currency, because 90% of transactions are in American dollars, and because over 60% of foreign holdings are in American dollars, people who hold dollars, being Americans, have a large advantage over everybody else, right? Again, my relatives in India, they have pieces of paper too called rupees, but people want the dollars and not the rupees. And what that allows, because the United States has that reserve currency status, Americans can issue currency a lot more easily and acquire more stuff, right? And more people are willing to purchase dollars and loan money to the United States with the expectation that they get more dollars in the future in the form of interest payments. So no matter how big a debt the US has or how large a deficit it is, for right now, interest rates are going to be low. Now, ask yourself, how many of you would want higher interest rates? Even if I could see you right now, my guess is nobody would raise your hand, right? Nobody wants higher interest rates unless you are perhaps someone that's lending money that hopes to get these things back, right? By having lower interest rates relative to the rest of the world, you can finance your education more easily. You can buy a car more easily. You can buy a home more easily. You can get a loan to start a business more easily. These are tangible things that benefit all of you if you are American, if you hold dollars. This is a tangible benefit that the system that was put in place in 1945 does, that makes your wealth bigger than a comparable person somewhere else, right? For me, I was educated in the United States. I grew up in that sense with a ton more advantages than a lot of other people, just given what I could borrow to do my education, since my ability to borrow to buy a home. My relatives in Mexico can't do that, right? You didn't typically borrow to buy a home in Mexico. Now it's becoming more prevalent, but before you had to basically put down cash. Same thing in India. So like you could do that here, right? You could start a business. You could get a loan to start to engage in college, right? And again, most people don't have those opportunities. At the same time, because everybody wants dollars and because everybody sends their money back to the United States based in the form of into commercial bank accounts, into the stock market, and into American debt. Just given how the system is structured, the U.S. government can keep taxes on the American public low, and it can borrow to finance its foreign policy, right? Even though that the United States has $1 trillion deficit and a multi-trillion-dollar debt, interest rates in the United States are very low. Now, in other areas, say for example, during the African debt crisis in the 1990s, the total debt that was acquired was several billion dollars, but interest rates on those states went very, very high. That doesn't happen in America, right? Which means that all of you benefit tangibly, right? You can finance your education, you can purchase a home, you can start a business by having the system in place the way it is, right? Which is a product of the security outcome of World War II. Now, again, is it worth changing to make it more equitable to the rest of the world? Given that the US is 5% of the world's population, the rest of the world is 95% of the population, how fair is it that 5% of the world's population enjoy these privileges? Well, let's do a thought exercise and see, are you willing to change it, right? So let's go through the example. Again, in 2019, the average liberal arts salary after graduation from UNC is approximately $60,000. I don't know what it will be in 2020, but right now, let's just say in those times when we didn't have any COVID crisis, it was about $60,000. So normally a student owes about $6,500 in federal taxes and about $3,150 to the state, assuming you stay in North Carolina, which leaves you with about $50,000. But if the United States, if things change, and the United States can't borrow as easily, and the dollar is no longer the world's reserve currency, the U.S. is going to have to start paying back that over $20 trillion debt that it's acquired. So it's going to have to raise taxes and start cutting services. So the standard deduction has to go down and the tax rate has to go up. These are estimates. You will also have to pay more in Social Security and Medicare taxes since borrowing is harder. There's more interest attached to that. And then you add up your normal standard monthly deductions and local taxes, gives you about $26,000 or about $2,166 per month or $541 per week. Again, that's what I lived on as a graduate student. That's not what you're going to school for, right? What you're going to school for is to try to make a much more significant salary, probably to pay back some of the debts that you've incurred to be here. So are you willing to jeopardize that, right? Are you willing to jeopardize what you have to make the world more equitable? And chances are, right, if you're really thinking about this, can you credibly do that? And the answer is no, right? And so most Americans are going to think about this, maybe feel bad that they have this privilege, but then move on and continue to enjoy those privileges. Given that, if that's how most Americans think, the goal of the US government then is to protect American power and to protect the privileged place that the United States has in the international system. So how does it do that? Well, power doesn't just come naturally to the United States. Power requires that the United States take specific actions to protect how important it is to the world and the place of the dollar in the world. So this is one example of this. This is a map from the U.S. Energy and Information Administration. A lot of my work is in energy politics, so I know this map quite well. And I happen to think that this is a significant reason why the United States is so important. It's because energy transactions are in American dollars. But if you look at this map, you can identify many of the key security threats in the world, and you can understand them as being related to energy. So take, for example, why is the United States so concerned about Iran? Well, 17% of the world's energy is originating out of that tiny 30-mile passageway known as the Strait of Hormuz. Block that off, suddenly a big chunk of the world's energy doesn't reach market. If that happens, currencies will collapse, commodity prices will go up, and everyone will look a lot less rich, and the U.S. will look a lot less powerful, right? So that's protecting the openness of the Strait of Hormuz is a critical security challenge, which is why the United States is so preoccupied with Iran, right? Similar things could be said about Saudi Arabia. As Iran threatens Saudi Arabia, it's critical that Saudi Arabia remain open. That's a reason. Now, how do you connect what's going on in the Strait of Hormuz to the war in Yemen? Yemen is not something which most Americans would think, well, we need to defend that. But the reason why is because Yemen sits at the opening to Bab el Mandab, which is another key choke point. 3.3% of the world's energy goes through there. If it doesn't make it through there, it has to go all the way around the Strait of Hormuz. And then why do you care about Egypt? Well, 4.5% of the world's energy is going through there. Turkish Straits, same thing. Venezuela, same thing. South China Sea dispute, tied in the same, right? Keeping these areas open, keeping these areas in business, that's where the hegemon comes in. That's what the hegemon is supposed to do. And if the United States is going to assume that role, that's what the United States has to do. Now, when you talk about transitions away from hegemony, something that's interesting, why do you think China is so interested in building islands out here? If they're able to do that, suddenly they're the ones controlling the flow of energy into the South China Sea, which, by the way, is critical for Japan and critical for South Korea, which are two big American allies, right? Why is Iran such a threat? Why is the war in Yemen such a threat? Why is the stability of Egypt such a threat, right? And why is it that the United States is so willing to do business with Turkey, despite their interesting records and despite Erdogan's interesting behavior? It's because this is the future of energy coming through the Black Sea. Why is it there's such a preoccupation with Maduro in Venezuela? Well, he has the largest oil supply on earth. And so that's a critical, since those are critical resources and a critical route that needs to be protected if the United States wants to keep its hegemonic status. Keeping that under American protection and out of Chinese protection or out of Russian protection, that's how hegemony is stabilized. So let's think about, right now that does seem to be the case. Again, if we think about the different commands, the United States has commands to deal with every part of the world. The United States can project power into every part of the world here. Other countries can't do that. Other countries are limited. China may be able to project power here and is starting to build some bases here and is starting to have a naval presence here, but doesn't have a large presence here and doesn't have a large presence here. Increasing presence in Africa, but less so in other areas. They're trying to build that, but less capable of doing that. Russia has more influence here, right? Some in the Pacific, though not a whole lot. Some in the Middle East, that's growing. But outside of that, there's less so. The United States, on the other hand, projects power into every single one of these regions with its combat commands. So the US is clearly the superpower and has much more capability to exert this power. And remember, as a result of COVID, more resources are coming back into the United States to purchase American dollars. That's what everyone wants to hold on to. The single biggest decision maker right now in the result of the COVID crisis, in part, is the president, but it's also the chairman of the Federal Reserve. So the US has a lot of influence over the globe still. Looks like it will for the foreseeable future. How might this change? Well, there's a couple of different areas where confidence in the United States may have been shaken. The war on terror is certainly one of them, right? The fact that the United States had difficulty subduing insurgencies in Afghanistan still and in Iraq, and the fact that ISIS returned and the fact that the Russians were successful in Syria. I think I put that in quotes because define success. That really did seem to shake the confidence of countries that have come to rely on the United States for protection, including the OPEC states. And if we look at some other states, like in Central Asia, Turkey looks like it's becoming increasingly brazen, increasingly willing to oppose American foreign policy objectives, though it sort of plays both sides on this. It's asking for Patriot missiles to defend against the Russians, but also defying the United States in other dimensions. And we also do see an increasingly reassertive Russia that's opposing many of the US initiatives throughout the world. Now, I should say Russia looks like it might be a significant threat, but something to bear in mind is that they are very vulnerable given the very significant collapse in the price of oil, and they have a declining population. So there's a lot of reasons why Russia may be behaving this way. One of them might be just desperation. And finally, if we look at the behavior of the American people, I think this is really the bigger, most significant interest and influence over this. Americans are increasingly less interested in having a global presence, at least it seems, right? According to some of the data that we saw, the United States and the American public seems to want a more cautious approach, a less engaged approach, less assertive American foreign policy. But if the United States is going to be able to maintain control over this very large world, in a sense, needs to have a more assertive foreign policy, right? It needs to be able to project its power out. It needs to be able to meet this myriad of challenges that are out there. One of these challenges is in the Pacific, right? And this is an area where the United States has faced increasing challenges from China, particularly in the South China Sea and over the Spratly Island chain. There's a couple of reasons for this. One is just a territorial dispute. China has long claimed that its territory extends to the entire Spratly Island chain, which is its claimed territorial waters. The belief is that China's territorial waters are actually more limited, right, with the blue line that indicates the declaration as to where the exclusive economic zone is. And we can see that there are several disputed islands in here with these gray dots. What the Chinese have done, as most of you may have been following, is to start to plop down these artificial reefs throughout the South China Sea with an intention, it looks like, to try to gradually establish a larger presence in the South China Sea and to push the Americans further east, right? What that means is that in this critical waterway, which creates an economy, it's critical for the states of Southeast Asia, China, Taiwan, Philippines, Brunei, Malaysia, and Indonesia, et cetera. There's several $1 trillion worth of goods and services going through this waterway, which also makes their way to Japan and Korea. This is critical to controlling, to being a hegemon in a sense. This is a critical area to exert some power and some control. And it looks like China is increasingly trying to push the United States out while maintaining a sphere of influence or reestablishing a sphere of influence to the territorial waters that it claims. There's also a belief that within the South China Sea, there's significant energy deposits underneath the waters, though they've been saying that for quite some time, since I was an undergraduate student, and yet nothing has come out of that yet. Again, if we look at the transit, right, these are the major flows of liquefied natural gas, which are critical. And you can see that an enormous amount is coming through this choke point right here, the Straits of Malacca. It then flows outward again to South Korea, to Japan, et cetera, right? This is a critical waterway. And in a sense, we can also see that some is coming from Australia through this waterway. That is a major economy. If you're going to be a global power, that's something you probably would want to control, right? Or it's something you would want to have influence over. If you want to be a Pacific power, that certainly seems like it is essential, right? And if you think about it from the Japanese perspective, and the South Korean perspective, one of the things that they gain from having or from cooperating with the United States is that the U.S. protects them from their commerce and protects them from the threats in the Pacific. So the U.S. has a vested interest in making sure that it has a role to play in the South China Sea. And China looks like it's increasingly trying to push the United States out of that. Right now, there's another complication to this when we look at challenges to hegemony, which is the U.S., or which Chinese also, in addition to the South China Sea, seem to be interested in this new project called the One Belt, One Road project, which is building outposts throughout Asia, connecting to Tehran and to Iran, and then connecting them by land into Europe. Again, by doing so, what it seems that this seems to be an effort is increasing China's profile as a global power, which we're seeing more and more that President Xi is trying to do. Complicated by the coronavirus outbreak, which seems to originate in China. But there still seems to be this effort to try to make China a global player. It's less successful heading into Europe, though China is investing quite a bit in Europe. But what we're seeing more of is Chinese influence in the Middle East, particularly with Iran. You're seeing Chinese influence in Pakistan as the United States recedes out of the area around Afghanistan. China seems to be taking the slack, and there's enormous Chinese influence in Africa, where China is now the leading partner or the leading investor in the continent. So gradually you're seeing the growth of an economic system that is, in a sense, has a big tie into Beijing. And then you add to it that the Chinese are now creating international institutions that are rivals of the U.S. created institutions after World War II, like the World Bank and the IMF. There's an economic system that's emerging here that may get to a point where it no longer needs the Americans at all and no longer needs their dollars at all. And this is an area where we're seeing a significant amount of growth in the world, right? So that's long-term down the road, a potential challenge to American hegemony happening, right? So you could argue, is there a transition happening? Well, this is worth thinking about. Is there a transition happening? Well, again, remember, the world from the American perspective after World War II was distorted, right? 5% of the world's population accounted for 50% of the world's gross domestic product, right? That doesn't seem acceptable. And what is an economy? Again, stop and think about that. An economy is the total value of goods and services produced. That's what gross domestic product is. Individuals within the economy, your population, produce those goods and services. What allows for the Americans to have such a large economy relative to everyone else There's several factors. One of them is that Americans happen to be more productive, right? The productivity of American labor is much higher because the U.S. has education, the U.S. has easy to borrow, et cetera, right? So the productivity of Americans tends to be higher, which allows the United States to have a much larger economy with a smaller population to China. But at some point in time, you would have to imagine Chinese individuals are going to be as productive as American individuals. And at that point, the Chinese economy will be larger than that of the United States. The same is true of India. The same is true with any country that has that large of a population, right, relative to the United States. And that's not something necessarily to be opposed, right? You would want people to be more productive. You would want them to be able to, maximize their contribution to the world. And, it's not necessarily the case that nationalism has to win, right? If something good comes from China, so be it, right? That seems like it's okay. So to some extent, it's inevitable. I don't like that word so much, but it seems like it will be the case that if current trends continue and if the population of China continues to be so large and India the same, those economies will be larger than that of the United States. I think that the security question is, what do you want to do about this? Right now, according to Organski, if we go back there, when there is that transition, right, when there's a dominant power and the challenger comes up, that's a moment for the dominant power maybe to initiate war. The commitment problem might see the same thing. Theoretically, it makes sense, I guess. But think about it practically. What do you mean go to war? What would you do, right? How would you go to war with China to ensure that they don't surpass the United States? Would you invade the mainland? That's crazy, right? Would you try to destroy all their naval power? They can just rebuild it, right? What is the intent? Is the intent to use nuclear weapons? That means that the United States will also suffer considerably. So I think the disconnect is, what exactly does war do, right? Maybe you can engage in a Cold War. Well, that's also costly, right? And that seems to be, in a sense, what the United States is doing now. There seems to be an effort to decouple the supply chains from China going into the United States. That will have costs, to be sure, right? Because one of the biggest purchasers of American debt for a long time was the Chinese. You could argue that by the 1990s and the 2000s, the Chinese were largely helping to fund American debt, which is essential for sustaining hegemony. Do you want to give that away, right? These are all questions to think about, right? Is a transition underway? To some extent, sure, it would have to be, right? Countries are going to get more powerful. They're going to get more productive. They're going to start to try to catch up. That's going to happen. The real next question is, if these countries are going to catch up, will the world still look the same way that it does today, right? Will the United Nations still have relevance? Will the World Bank still have relevance? Will the IMF still have relevance? Those are the institutions that the U.S. created after World War II to protect its power over the long haul. If those institutions continue to have power, the United States will continue to have power, even as it reaches parity with some of these other countries. But if these institutions are wholesale rejected, then there's a real problem, right? Because then these institutions that kept the United States in the game, so to speak, who were intended to keep the United States in the game for the long haul, then they're rejected, right? And then that means that unless the United States can maintain the power that it has right now, it will also be rejected. Now, good news is that most states still think that the UN is relevant, still think that the World Bank is relevant, still think that the IMF is relevant, still think that many of the institutions that the United States created are relevant and still is doing business in dollars. So far, so good, right? And still thinks of the United States as being a country that's capable of intervening everywhere. So that's good. Now, the one thing to worry about, I think, is the United States. And if you're American, and I happen to be, it's us, right? There's a new isolationism emerging within the United States. I remember several years ago when there was a debate as to whether or not the United States should raise its debt ceiling, which means should it allow the United States to pay the bills that it's incurred already. There was talk about defaulting. Now imagine what would happen if the United States defaulted on its debt. Suddenly American dollars would not be worth as much as they used to, which means that interest rates in the United States would have to go up. And most of the world would start looking for another protector of their order, right? So it could be some other country. That's cataclysmic, right? Since that's cataclysmic might be too much, but it's catastrophic for the United States if it decides to default, right? And the other question is not just the economic realm, because in the economic realm, most of the elites seem to be willing to continue the system that exists right now. But in terms of the foreign policy preference, in terms of the foreign policy initiatives, the foreign policy leadership, the setting the example, the playing the significant role in international institutions, the protecting of international institutions, multilateralism generally, right? Those are key parts of keeping America powerful. Those are key parts of what made the United States as powerful as it was since 1945. But increasingly, it looks like the United States is looking inward and not thinking about that anymore, and maybe considering maybe it shouldn't play as big a role on the international stage. I don't know if many Americans have comprehended how much that might hurt as far as their finances. But I do know that many Americans that have seen their children go off to war, or may have gone off to war themselves, might come to the perfectly reasonable explanation that such a big role on the international stage may not be worth doing anymore. I could see an argument from many Americans that if maintaining hegemony means that you have to support Saudi Arabia, which engages in human rights abuses, maybe it's not worth it anymore. Probably like anything, the truth is somewhere in the middle, I would say. You might want to think about it that way. But I invite you to think about it, right? I want you to think about it. How much of a role should the United States continue to have? Is it time for the United States to start pulling back from its multilateral commitments? Or is it the case that the United States cannot pull away, should not pull away, has too much to lose from pulling away? The readings are going to talk about that a little bit in the discussion part. But I want you to think about that, and I want you to ponder that. And I want you not only to ponder that, I want you to hold on to that throughout this course and past this course. If this course has done anything, I hope you keep that debate in mind. What we're going to look at in the third block after the exam is what are some of the challenges that may emerge that are threatening where the U.S. is right now. Terrorism is being one of them. Civil wars in other states is one of them. Isolationism is one of them. Populism, financial crises, etc. We're going to talk about several of these and then think about how long can the United States keep this position that has been created for it. And is it going to be the United States that ultimately rejects it?